Hello, my name is Stacey Liguori, and welcome to an overview of the Special Education Indicators. The U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP, developed 17 indicators to help each state measure and report on its efforts to educate students with disabilities. All states and territories submit various data and reports to the U.S. Department of Education. Each state reports on its performance on each of the indicators as well as its plan to make progress in the State Performance Plan and Annual Performance Report, SPP APR. The APR must be submitted annually. In today's module, we will be discussing an overview of Indicator 10, Disproportionate Representation in Specific Disability Categories. Indicator 10 is part of the SPP APR. What is Indicator 10? Indicator 10 is a compliance indicator, meaning that the indicator's target is 0% or 100%, and this target is set by the Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP. OSEP has set Indicator 10's compliance target to 0%. Indicator 10 is the percentage of local school districts with a disproportionate representation of racial and ethnic groups in a specific disability category that is the result of an inappropriate identification. Disproportionate representation means the percentage of the groups in special education differs significantly from the percentage in the general school population. Data collection. The Office of Special Education and Early Learning, OSEAL, collects Indicator 10 data through LEA-provided information as self-reported in Infinite Campus, IC, via the December 1 child count. The OSEAL then compares the number of students with disabilities in each district with a data set on December 1 of the reporting year. Once the child count data are complete and verified, the LEA level identification data by each of the 7 racial and ethnic groups and specific disability categories are reviewed to determine if disproportionate representation exists. For LEAs identified as having a disproportionate representation, the OSEAL reviews policies, procedures, and practices for the appropriate identification of students with disabilities. The OSEAL also reviews student-specific records in each racial and ethnic group identified with a disproportionate representation. The OSEAL uses this review to determine if the disproportionate representation identified was due to an inappropriate policy, procedure, and practice. The OSEAL uses risk ratio methodology to determine if disproportionate representation exists in LEAs. The risk ratio methodology identifies LEAs who have disproportionate representation in the identification of students in particular groups. Annually, the OSEAL uses risk ratio to determine if disproportionate representation exists in the LEAs. For Indicator 10, OSEAL applies this methodology to determine if disproportionate representation by race and ethnicity and identify as a child with a specific disability category exists when identifying students for special education services. For example, how many times greater is a Hispanic student's risk of being identified as eligible for special education and related services for a specific learning disability, SLD, compared with all other racial ethnic groups in the LEA? The risk ratio is applied to determine if there is a disproportionate representation by race or ethnicity. Risk ratio means The comparison of two risks. The risk of the subgroup under examination is compared to the risk of all other students not in that subgroup of being subject to the same outcome. Frequently asked question. Question. If an LEA is identified for having a specific racial or ethnic category this year, could an LEA be identified for the same category next year? Answer. LEAs will be identified annually if their risk ratio is 2.25 or greater, and the review of policies, procedures, and practices is found to be inappropriate. When an LEA meets the risk ratio requirement for identification for Indicator 10, the OCEAL will complete a desk review to determine if the LEA is correctly identifying students in the identified racial or ethnic category. In summary, Indicator 10 measures disproportionate representation of racial, ethnic groups in specific disability categories due to inappropriate identification. When a district is identified as being disproportionate, there will be a review of policy, procedure, and practices to determine whether the disproportionate representation was due to an inappropriate identification. Here are some resources for your review. Thank you for viewing this webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to access the SPP Indicator Guide on the Special Education Data Dashboard webpage, or you may contact the Division of IDEA Monitoring and Results in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning.